Hello and welcome to Revision Tips for SIPS Level 5 Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 15, Advanced Negotiation, and it's Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand negotiation relationships and ethics. So we're going to look at assessing the changing relationship within the process and ethics as it influences on the negotiation process. So honesty takes time to establish and it's often demonstrated rather than stated. And there should be evidence of honesty and business integrity in the boardroom because organisational culture begins at the top and affects all areas of the business. So organisational culture has characteristics like it generates culture in the rest of the business and it influences management decisions as well as the business functions. It affects meetings, negotiations and use of social media, the hiring policies and the supply chain engagements. It encompasses an organisation's values, business, visions and working styles, beliefs, behaviours and habits. So a perceived lack of honesty can lead to behaviours that negatively affect the culture or the working relationships or negotiation outcomes. So let's go through some of the points. We've got conflicts of interest, where someone in a position of power is there to derive personal benefit from the actions or decisions made in their official capacity. So it's a set of circumstances in which a professional judgment or action may be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. Hidden agendas, a secret or ulterior motive for something, where the discussion is being driven by a consideration that has not been fully disclosed, leaving one party at a disadvantage. Favouritism or partiality, where there's a lack of objective in decision making due to an advantage being driven or given to one party over another, usually over an extended period of time. False or exaggerated claims, where there are false or exaggerated claims about the expertise, abilities or involvement of a person or company, leading to dissatisfaction from the customer in the level of quality of the product or service. Lack of confidentiality is where key information is not kept completely confidential, whether intentionally or not. It will jeopardise a negotiation. And any previous breach of trust, where evidence of past dishonesty or a historical breach of trust threatens to undermine the basis for honesty in a current negotiation. The success or failure of a negotiation relies heavily on how much the negotiation party trust each other to implement the outcomes. So a good negotiator should be trustworthy. That doesn't mean you need to reveal the entire negotiation strategy up front, but each party must reveal something credible. You know, trustworthy behaviour is hard to take, or so I should say it's hard to actually fake. And trust can be viewed as a spiral, you know, capable of rising as it builds up. But when trust starts to be lost, loss in faith can result in constant downward spiral. The contemporary care matrix illustrates how trust is built. And it's based on competency and care. You can see the capability care matrix on the screen. Now, the trust quadrant is naturally the most secure basis for a negotiation. So an example of a buyer's state of mind for each quadrant is given as distrust, let's say. I do not believe you are capable or competent, and I do not trust you. And I don't believe you care about what's important to me. There's virtually no basis here to continue a negotiation or a relationship. The seller should be withdrawn or replaced. When you get into a position of respect, you're saying, I believe you to be capable and competent, but I don't believe you care about what's important to me. So the relationship will probably be cordial, and there may be things you can learn from that relationship, and there'll be things that can be helpful, but there's also no basis for a long-term relationship because the seller doesn't really show enough interest or care about your objectives. In the affection box, you're saying things like, well, I feel you show a high level of interest and care about my objectives, but you lack the competency to deliver against these. And the relationship may be warm and friendly, but cannot progress if the buyer cannot trust the supplier's capability to deliver against it. And then finally, trust. The seller appears competent and shows an understanding and care of my objectives. Mutual trust can be built, thus providing a secure basis for successful negotiation. But some of the behaviours that can undermine trust in negotiation is what I said earlier: conflict of interest, hidden agendas, favouritism, false or exaggerated claims, lack of confidentiality, or previous breaches of trust. So how do we assess the situation? Situational aspects of negotiation represent any characteristics that are not personal to the negotiator or characteristics of culture between them. So the situational aspects are, they're things like, what are the interests at stake? What's the timing of the negotiation? What is the geographical location? Is this a single or repetitive negotiation? And what are suppliers' values? And do they conflict with yours? These points help us to understand the other party in advance of the meeting, can clearly help with pre-meeting preparation. Using modern negotiation technology, you can gain the buyer a wide assessment of the supplier, allowing them to assess the whole situation. So this modern technology has made assessing a negotiation party much easier because it offers a broad arrangement of information that gives you a better picture. So the advantages is, the crowdsourcing model, which is sort of gathering information and opinions from a large group of people via the internet. That's useful because opinions gathered and dispersed are varied. You can also look at things like social media, Twitter, Facebook. They can give you reviews, things that are up to date, and show you exactly how customers are feeling. But the downside is information overload. You might take into account some bad reviews, but then a customer could have an ulterior motive. And sometimes it's a misunderstanding of a customer's experience. You almost need a more in-depth background to a company's research about their financial standing and stuff, which doesn't necessarily come through the usual modern technology research. So if we place the negotiation in the long-term concept, on the long-term context, I mean, sometimes longer-term relationships should be a one-off event, only at the start of a contract. Many negotiations happen over a long term, especially for large complex projects. So, for example, if you were building submarines for the Ministry of Defence or a large construction project. But in long-term context, more uncertainty and risk are found in a project. They cannot be foreseen at the start, usually due to complex nature of the programme. So negotiation focuses on these long-term concepts by resolving these risks and issues to everyone's satisfaction and ensuring milestones and budgets are met. But if you have a project like a construction project in excess of 10 years, these are things like infrastructure developments, motorways, telecom projects. The project itself or the construction may not be as much as 10 years, but the finance and investment will span a much longer period. But the main problem of this length is managing the change that will inevitably occur and the risks of these changes that it will bring for a short period in the contract. So, for example, changes in digital technology, change for climate change, geopolitical fluctuations. So a lot of these factors that come from the steeple analysis need to be taken into consideration, and you need some awareness of these potential risks. Now, positional negotiation is when a sequence of positions is taken on areas like price, quality, timescales. Positional negotiations can often be counterproductive. The disadvantages will include individuals becoming entrenched and rigid, not wanting to go and back down, and preventing them from progressing forward to a wise agreement. Arguing over position endangers ongoing relationships. Decision making becomes difficult and time consuming, and tactics such as delaying progress, threatening to walk out, and stonewalling become the norm. And a contest of wills over position develops rather than joint goals. So the alternative to this is something called a principled negotiation, or negotiation on the merits, which has become widely used as a means for achieving a win-win outcome. Principled negotiations state the negotiation should be judged on 3 criteria. It should be a wise agreement, and if possible, it should be efficient, and it should improve or at least not damage the relationship between the parties. But the 4 basic requirements is to separate the people from the problem, focus on the interests, not the positions, devise many options for mutual gain before deciding what to do, and insist that the results are based on objective criteria. In contrast to positional negotiation, principled negotiations focus on basic interests, mutually satisfying options, and fair standards, resulting in that wise agreement, which is less time consuming to reach. So how do we separate the people from the problem? The 2 different components in negotiation is the parties involved and the issues or problem being assessed. So separating the people from the problem is the first principle. People, particularly untrained negotiators, can become personally involved in the issues and the respective position they're either expected to take or have taken. They may feel resistance to their position as a personal attack. They frequently use positional bargaining processes in which each party uses their own opening position as a starting point and negotiate towards the other party's position, encouraging a win-lose approach. For example, the parties may begin with widely different starting positions when haggling over a price, and any concession that brings the price closer to the other party's target will take it further away from the other. So positional bargaining is a wasteful approach because it is inefficient as a way of reaching an agreement, encouraging stubbornness, and tends to lead to the outcome that satisfies one party over another. But professional negotiations understand that they are, for the most part, not negotiating for themselves, but for their employer. They can disagree forcefully on the issues, but it doesn't mean they take any insult or become abusive or fall out. Depersonalizing the situation and accepting that the subject matter of the negotiation and not the people should be the focus can be difficult for untrained negotiators, but this is a skill to develop. So there are 4 perceived options for mutual gain from a negotiation. An integrative negotiation agreement, in theory, is where the negotiation parties have reached an agreement after fully taking into account each other's interests, with no further improvement possible, and all resources and creative options are exploited. Distributive bargaining is where the negotiator doesn't expect to deal with the other person's gain, such as in a high expenditure, low risk matrix of the Crowjet matrix. The buyer may not need the supplier's continued goodwill, and it may be appropriate for one party to try and acquire a larger share. This is sometimes represented as a win-lose approach, such as in negotiation for a house or a car. And then gamesmanship. The stakes are high and the rules are exploited to the legitimate limit to gain maximal advantage for one party. The use of tricks and ploys, often psychological, is expected here. And brinkmanship, where the line of legitimacy is crossed and winning at all costs becomes acceptable, even to the dangerous extreme and to the brink of conflict. And that's to achieve an end result. So if you wish to achieve the right objective in a negotiation, the price and delivery dates, etc., you do have to share information and data with your supplier. This will enable them to offer you the best solution for your needs, but it means there will need to be an openness in sharing information. If they don't meet your requirements, other suppliers are available. So sharing confidential information can be a risk to a business. In the cases of a non-disclosure agreement, that can protect this information from being shared further. It contains strict penalties if that happens. So types of information typically shared might be your sales forecast, product drawings, market research, financial information, internal costs, and supply chain data. The growth of global sourcing has led to more cross-cultural situations. Perceived unethical behaviour of people and other traditions and nationalities may lead to stereotyping, particularly where there's a lack of understanding about a supplier's culture. For example, Asian cultures are more likely to view the giving of gifts, entertainment, and personal favours as appropriate when cultivating a business relationship, where it may not be acceptable to the British or American person. But these stereotypes can block you from seeing the individual, and you may be too quick to erroneously assume unethical behaviour in that culture. There are 6 elements to consider in cross-cultural negotiations: the business systems, religious and belief systems, the legal systems, the infrastructure and logistics systems, the financial and fiscal systems, as well as the social and political systems. Successful outcomes. This can include things like mitigating the risk of cross-cultural error and the increased chance of getting that wrong. So do research your counterpart's background and experience to find out how much expertise they have in international negotiation. Enlist an advisor to coach you in the national and local situation, or hire a translator to provide information on the background and specifics of your business and any unusual business or technical terms. Use a team approach and listen carefully to ensure that you're aware of any unfolding dynamics of the negotiation. Now, there's no recognised single definition of bribery and corruption, and global legislation differs in its attempts in incorporating corrupt acts in many forms. But if I was to summarise it, I would say bribery is the offer, promise, or giving of a financial or other advantage for private gain, intending that, as a consequence, a relevant function or activity will be performed improperly. So bribery can be committed to obtain or retain a contract or another business advantage. Now, corruption is the request, achievement, agreement to receive or accept a financial or other advantage, intending that as a consequence, a relevant function or activity is performed improperly. And then fraud is the overarching descriptor that covers both bribery and corruption. Fraud is the intentional act, omission, or misrepresentation with the aim of misleading another party for financial gain. The World Bank defines fraud as the abuse of public office for private gain. There are specific areas of risk during various stages of the procurement process. They have implications for the negotiation process. So in the identification of business needs, it could be that stakeholders may be manipulated to facilitate bribery and corruption. So you can mitigate against that by doing checks against previous requirements and ruling out any misrepresentation. In the design and specification, it may be deliberately biased to dishonestly influence the award of a contract towards a particular supplier. So get the design and spec independently verified. In the pre and post qualification, it could be that, the process has been influenced to allow inferior contracts through the selection process, and that could lead to fraud later on. So you can mitigate that by making sure you have a rigorous pre-qualification process and compare company data against supplier data to determine any conflicts of interest. In the bid evaluation and selection, You might see that scoring is manipulated, again, to influence the selection and award of contract. So you validate the supplier's policies, you verify previous works, and you have an internal method of evaluation, which means it's scored them by more than one person and moderated. And finally, contract award. That could be manipulated or influenced regardless of the selection process through falsified documentation. So mitigate that by including clauses covering anti-bribery and audits, both unannounced and announced, within the supplier contract. Now, 4 of the international anti-corruption initiatives were established as part of a global movement to eradicate bribery and corruption. So you've got the World Economic Forum Partnering Against Corruption initiative. That's a global, multi-industry, multi-stakeholder anti-corruption initiative set up to raise business standards and to contribute to the competitive, transparent, accountable and ethical business society. That includes fostering dialogue between business and governments. You've got the United Nations Global Compact, a strategic policy initiative for businesses committed to aligning their operations and strategies with 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. Then you've got the EITI, a global coalition of governments and companies, civil working societies that work together to improve openness and accountability of revenues from natural resources. The EITI works as a prevention mechanism that encourages transparency of revenue flows and production data to reduce the space for corrupt practices. And lastly, the TI, the Transparency International, with over 100 national chapters globally. They work with a number of partners in government, business and civil society to mitigate against any bribery. This includes the production and publications on countries and sector-specific risks. Now, there are specific areas of risks and various actions a buyer can take to reduce the risk of corruption. But don't forget, these corrupt activities are frequently identified through corrupt links or payments to other suppliers, links to foreign public officials, evasion of tax payments, the avoidance of licensing, the use of agents, and the appearance of excessive payments or money laundering, avoiding other regulatory requirement or illicit payments to custom officials, as well as product substitution. So a robust probing and insightful negotiation is vital to ensuring that all suppliers compete on a level playing field. Behaviours, intentions and actions must be honest, transparent and free from corruption. And as a procurement organisation, you must be able to assess a supplier's anti-corruption system and control to prevent, detect and respond to potential bribery and corruption threats. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 2. Thank you for watching.